If you've been following our journey for a while now, then I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of gardening under deep mulch, and more specifically, the Ruth Stout method. Because by now, we've discussed this topic at great length in a number of videos. But just in case you're new here, the super quick version is that covering your growing area with a thick layer of organic plant matter helps to retain moisture and suppress weeds. It also shades the surface in summer, insulates it in winter, and as the mulch breaks down over time, it even provides nutrients to your soil as a form of composting in place. All of this results in less watering, less weeding, and less amending. Or in other words, less stress and less work. Now, I think the best generic name for this technique would be deep mulch gardening or year-round mulching or something similar to those. However, it's often referred to by us and others as the Ruth Stout method, after the author, speaker, and all-around wonderful character, Ruth Stout. And the reason for that is because she was one of this method's best advocates during the second half of the 20th century, when she published 9 or 10 gardening books and a long-running series of articles in the Organic Gardening and Farming magazine. We've posted another video all about her and her method previously, so please see the link in the description for more details. But suffice it to say, she is definitely one of our primary gardening inspirations. And if you can get your hands on any of her books, I would highly recommend giving them a read. Not only are they packed with wisdom and experience, but her wit and charm, as well as her casual style, make her books feel like you're having a tea with your grandmother, rather than just learning about gardening. Now, over the past 4 or 5 years, we've been using variations of this method in all of our garden experiments, and while some have been more successful than others, the mulch seems to have always been a benefit. However, just because it does most things really well, doesn't mean it does everything perfectly. And while it can sometimes seem like a magic bullet, as it turns out, it's not completely without its flaws. So in this video, I want to talk about deep mulch's kryptonite, or its Achilles heel. But I'm not referring to some obscure element from a comic book, or a mythical vulnerability explained only through legend and magic. No, Ruth Stout's worst enemy is well within our natural understanding. Or rather, it's in the nature right under where we're standing. You see, as I mentioned, a thick layer of mulch does a really good job at smothering out existing weeds and preventing new seeds from reaching the soil. But in our experience and in our area, we've discovered 4 weeds that can still regularly make it through. The first 2 are the vetch and clover, both of which appear thin and delicate but are surprisingly adept at weaving their way through thick, tangled hay. However, we're not particularly concerned about them, because when they're noticed, they're easy to pull. And when they're not, as legumes, they actually help with nitrogen fixation, so they could technically be seen as natural allies. The third weed is the tall, sturdy milkweed, whose ability to beat mulch comes less from flexibility and more from brute force, because it's just such a strong plant that it can push its way through just about anything. But unlike the vetch and clover, there's no chance of missing it when it does, because these things are simply huge. However, they're also an important nesting site and food source for young monarch butterflies, and their uniquely beautiful flowers are a huge draw for native pollinators. So unless they're really in the way, we tend to just leave them be. But that brings us to the fourth weed that commonly makes it through our deep layer of mulch, and we've really saved the worst for last. Because unlike the others, it's just really difficult to see any redeeming qualities about this particular uninvited, unwanted, and unrelenting pest. And I'm of course talking about grass. But not just any run-of-the-mill grass, because mulch typically does a pretty good job with many members of that family as well. However, there is one specific type of grass that has a secret weapon it keeps concealed just below the surface. More on that in a moment. Around here, we refer to this type of grass as quackgrass. But 65 years ago in Connecticut, Ruth Stout called it witchgrass. And from what we've read, others still have referred to it as quickgrass, couchgrass, quitchgrass, scutchgrass, twitchgrass, devil's grass, and a whole host of other names. But no matter what alias it goes by, the one thing most people agree on is that this grass is amazingly good at reproducing. It's like the Trouble with Tribbles episode in the original Star Trek series. And while particularly prolific grass is great if you're trying to prevent erosion, in the garden or on the farm, it's, well, a nightmare. So, in her book, How to Have a Green Thumb Without an Aching Back, Ruth Stout describes her first encounter with quackgrass as follows. One morning in late May, I went to the garden and started to cultivate the young parsley. I came across some grass which baffled me because there seemed to be no end to the root. It ran along under the ground like a piece of thick white string, and pretty soon another green shoot showed up, and another, and another. I realized that it was no ordinary problem because the white part ran along under the parsley and it was difficult to get it out without injuring the tiny plants. I worked away at it slowly and painstakingly, not even wondering if it was very widely spread. It hadn't occurred to me that it could be overnight. I hadn't noticed it the day before. Upon mentioning this peculiar weed to her friend Arthur, the two of them inspected the rest of her garden and found it to be completely full of the stuff. And unfortunately, he knew exactly what it was, calling it the #1 enemy of farmers in the way of weeds. He went on to say that when a man gets it in his garden as bad as you've got it, he gives up that spot and plows up another place that's free of it. But can this grass really be that serious of a problem? Well, according to the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, or OMAFRA for short, quackgrass is a widespread and serious weed, and traditionally one of the most difficult to control. It was originally from Europe and Asia, but it's assumed to have followed global exploration routes and human migration by piggybacking within cereal crops. And today, it is often considered to be one of the 3 most serious weeds around the world, because it infests 37 different crops in 65 different countries. Here in Canada, it was first identified in 1861, but today it can be found in all 10 provinces as well as the Northwest Territories. And according to OMAFRA, a recent survey estimated that 56% of Canadian farmland has quackgrass present. And unfortunately, its presence, if left untreated, can spell disaster for the farmer. For example, it can reduce crop yields by as much as 85% in corn, 55% in soybeans, and up to 57% in wheat. But to fully understand what makes quackgrass such a particularly bad pest, I think it's best if we start with some brief grass anatomy. Now, when we think of grass, we typically picture a thick green lawn, a soccer field, or a golf course. But as it turns out, the grass family is actually made up of over 12,000 different species, and includes everything from turf grass to wheat, and from corn to bamboo. So despite our bias towards traditional green monocultures, grass is actually quite diverse. However, most grass species do share some common characteristics, and so that's what we'll focus on here. First of all, much like the strawberries and asparagus that we've discussed in previous videos, the base of a grass plant is called the crown. And this is where energy and nutrients are transferred between the roots below ground and the stem above. But the stem of a grass plant is actually called a culm, and it's subdivided into solid nodes and the typically hollow space between them called internodes. But the nodes are especially important because it's from them that grass sprouts its most iconic feature, the blades, or in other words, the leaves of the grass plant. And while most species, if left unmowed, will contain between 3 and 10 leaves, in the case of bamboo, it can even sprout up to 100 or more. So those are the basic parts of a single grass plant, but a single grass plant is rarely ever seen alone. So next we should probably discuss reproduction. Now, the most obvious form of plant reproduction is sexual reproduction, through the development and eventual scattering of seeds. And grass is no exception, because at the top of the culm, the grass plant is terminated by an unusual-looking flower, which eventually becomes a seed head. And in the case of quackgrass, each seed head typically produces between 25 and 40 seeds. So if we're hoping to prevent grass from growing in our gardens, then it makes sense that a thick layer of mulch would be a huge benefit, because it effortlessly blocks the seeds from ever reaching the soil below. And because we never remove the mulch at the end of the season, even the seeds which may have already been present in the soil will be starved of sunlight and therefore hopefully prevented from ever germinating. But quackgrass seeds can remain viable in those conditions for up to 6 years, even if first passed through the digestive system of an animal. So consistent mulch cover throughout that entire time is pretty important. However, just because sexual reproduction is the most obvious option doesn't mean it's the only option. You see, grass can also reproduce vegetatively, either through bunching or creeping. Orchard grass is an example of a bunching grass, because for it, vegetative reproduction occurs when new daughter plants, called tillers, sprout up from the crown. Then, with the production of more and more tillers over time, bunchgrass forms into a thick patch of tightly packed plants that stand out like a sore thumb when they turn up in your lawn. But luckily, it doesn't spread very quickly, unlike the creeping grass, also known as sod-forming grass, which spreads very quickly by either sending out horizontal above-ground stems, called stolons, or horizontal below-ground stems, called rhizomes, the latter of which is where our quackgrass comes in. And it's those rhizomes that make it such a worthy foe. You see, quackgrass is really good at growing rhizomes. In fact, it's been recorded that one single quackgrass plant was able to produce 154 meters worth. That's over 500 feet. But rhizomes don't just extend out for the sake of it. You see, their purpose is to weave their way through the competition and eventually send up new shoots when the conditions allow for it. And even once the new shoot is established, the rhizomes remain as a type of support network, storing energy and nutrients and sharing them with other connected plants as needed. So that single quackgrass plant was also recorded to have produced over 200 daughter plants. But it gets worse, because rhizomes aren't just prolific, they're also fast, typically growing 2.5 centimeters or about an inch per day. And if that doesn't sound very fast, then keep in mind that they're also stealthy. As I mentioned, rhizomes are horizontal stems that grow just below the surface, so one unnoticed plant can be all that it takes to rapidly take over an entire garden bed, because by the time you see them, it's probably too late. For example, if we pull aside some of the mulch and topsoil, we can clearly see the rhizomes that have been creeping into the beds from the adjacent sod-covered path. Whereas this first seemed like grass that was sprouting up from within the bed, it quickly becomes clear that it's actually an invasion from the outside. And each of these daughter plants will eventually release more rhizomes and then their own daughter plants, and if left unattended, would in time take over the entire garden. But quackgrass doesn't just overcrowd and compete for space, it also competes for nutrients, using up around 50% or more of the total nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium available for plant use. And as if all that wasn't bad enough, quackgrass is also alleliopathic, meaning that it actually releases biochemicals that inhibit the growth of surrounding organisms. So it isn't just a passive pest, it also actively attacks your veggies. So with all this in mind, how does the Ruth Stout method of permanent deep mulch stand up against such an adversary? Well, unfortunately, it doesn't. In fact, Ruth described her frustration with it as follows. It is a great deal harder to cope with than the crabgrass which gets in your lawn and annoys you. It behaves like asparagus. That is, you can't kill it by piling leaves or hay on it as you can with ordinary grass, weeds, or other plants. Like asparagus, it creeps under the ground and reaches up right through anything you put on top of it. Even if you put a wide board on a spear of quackgrass, it will defeat you by creeping under the board until it gets to the edge of it, then it comes up again. Not defiantly, but nonchalantly, which makes you even madder. And that brings us to the final quality of quackgrass that makes it so difficult to control. Its ability to pierce through just about anything you put on top of it. For example, the usual 8 inches of hay is no match for quackgrass, and adding a few layers of newspaper may slow it down, but only slightly. The same goes for a layer of cardboard. And from what we've read, wood chips will work, but only if they're laid out over a foot thick. And believe it or not, we've even had it come up through a thin polytarp. It took a while, but it made it. And the reason is because of the surprisingly tough, needle-sharp tips of the rhizomes. In fact, these things are so tough and sharp that they can push their way through full-sized potato tubers. And as you can see, we've even found a couple that made their way through some of our smaller garlic bulbs as well. But we're not in the business of just pointing out problems without at least trying to present solutions. So, if like us, you discover some of this grass in your garden, what should you do? Well, from what we can tell, you have several options. First of all, you can do like Ruth's friend Arthur suggested and simply give up on it and start a new garden somewhere else. But for most of us, that's not a desirable solution. And as it turns out, that's not what Ruth did either. Instead, she spent an entire summer slowly and painstakingly digging up her entire garden and pulling out every last piece of grass and rhizome, and then dug a deep trench on the side where the quackgrass was invading. Her thought was that quackgrass can creep, but it can't jump a trench, so hopefully this would act like a rhizome barrier and prevent future infestations. And in the end, the digging did work, but it was a lot of work, and it was also a risk. Because as it turns out, the rhizomes actually have one more trick up their sleeves. You see, much like the comb of the grass plant, the rhizomes are also subdivided by nodes, and each of them are capable of drawing on that stored energy and sprouting new shoots even once separated from the rest of the plant. So if Ruth were to have accidentally left behind even a single section of rhizome, that could have been enough to start the entire infestation all over again. So I think I'd personally reserve this method for small infestations, or places where more large-scale solutions aren't possible. However, the stored nutrients are finite, and so the rhizomes are not completely inexhaustible. which is why another possible method is to simply till the area to destroy the existing plants. Then, once the now chopped up rhizomes grow new shoots, you simply till it again, right before the new leaves have had a chance to photosynthesize. The idea is that if you keep repeating this over and over, the rhizomes will eventually use up all of their stored energy, and the infestation will fizzle out. But from what I gather, this requires careful timing, and one false move being all it would take to make the initial problem look like child's play. And of course, for those of us who would rather remain no-till, it isn't a perfect solution from that perspective either. Oh, and along the same lines, there are also chemical approaches to rid the soil of vegetation. But since we aim to work with nature whenever possible, that's obviously not an avenue we'd personally choose to explore. But one option that we have considered is using a heavy-duty silage tarp to smother out the grass over the course of an entire season. This is a great non-invasive approach, but it's also not without its downsides. For instance, this method typically leaves you without access to your growing area for at least a year. And since the seeds and rhizomes can remain viable for longer than that, you'll still likely be left with ongoing problems. So, what to do? Well, we're encouraged by an update that Ruth included in one of her other books called Gardening Without Work, where she relayed some preliminary results of an experiment conducted by her gardening advisor and friend named Dick Clements. He stated that the thing to do might be to begin by covering the flourishing grass leaves with hay, enough to kill them. Wait for more leaves to emerge, kill these, and so on, until no more leaves appeared. So in June, once the grass was 6 inches tall, he began the test, saying, "I flattened the grass as I spread the hay over it, and ended with some 3 inches of hay cover. By early July, some new leaves were making their appearance, and I added another inch of hay. I have done this once since, and only a few spears are now, in August, starting to show. I shall smother these shortly, but it looks to me as if the performance is getting real results. The crucial test, I suppose, will come next spring, and perhaps the whole patch will then be as green as ever. But if not, there is going to be a better solution to the quackgrass problem than any I have heard of yet, and I am hopeful enough at the prospect to tell you about it now." So his solution is similar to the tilling approach, except that rather than chopping up the plants, he simply smothered them with more mulch. But either way, the primary concept is the same. Continuously allow the grass to use up its stored energy, without ever affording it the opportunity to produce more through photosynthesis. Do this long enough, and in theory, the plants will simply die off. And so, in our garden, we've chosen to take inspiration from each of these methods, and have hopefully found a solution that will work well for us. It's a fairly big undertaking, and we've been slowly working on it all summer. But we've also been documenting the progress and will, of course, be posting videos about it in due time. But essentially, our solution consists of the following. First, we need to kill off the grass in between our garden beds. We initially thought that with the help of a mower, the natural ground cover on our paths would make for a convenient source of free mulch. But in actuality, it turns out that it's become little more than a quackgrass nursery, allowing the grass to constantly send in rhizomes to establish new daughter plants amongst our veggies, all the while having a well-established support network to help keep everything going. So, we plan to smother this area by sheet mulching. Our hope is that the initial application will smother out the bulk of the vegetation, but once the quackgrass inevitably breaks through with its new shoots, we'll do our best to pull or cover them right away. Again, our hope is that if we stay on top of this long enough, the grass will eventually die off. And in the meantime, we'll use Ruth's digging approach to painstakingly remove any grass that's already made it into our beds. Of course, we prefer not to dig whenever possible, but I think this situation justifies the disruption. Then, as a preventative measure, we'll also extend the sheet mulching to a few feet outside the fence as well. This way, once everything is eventually grass-free within the fence, this border should hopefully act as a wide enough barrier to keep the infestation from creeping in again. At that point, we should ideally only ever have to keep an eye on the perimeter. But we can always fall back on Ruth's trench idea as well, because again, quackgrass can creep, but it can't jump a trench. Or at least so we hope. But all of this has been happening in conjunction with finally finishing our actual fence as well. So we'll soon have some videos about that too. But in the meantime, thanks so much for watching till the end, especially in this case with an over 20-minute video all about grass. You guys are obviously the best, so thanks again, and we'll see you soon. Oh good, you're still here, because I do have one more thing to add. You see, in the many weeks it took me to put this video together, I've had a bit of time to reconsider my earlier statement about it being really difficult to see any redeeming qualities about quackgrass. And it now occurs to me that, while true from a gardener's perspective, from a strictly biological standpoint, quackgrass is actually quite amazing. In fact, the only reason we're even talking about it at all is because it's just so good at what it does. I mean, if anything, my level of annoyance is really an indication of its level of success. Not that it's trying to annoy me, but rather that we're in competition. And so far, it's been winning. I guess what I'm trying to say is that through nature's lens, quackgrass has nothing to redeem itself for. And frankly, if the roles were reversed, I think quackgrass would be just as justified in labeling me the pest. But anyway, back to our human perspective. As it turns out, quackgrass does have a few positive qualities after all. For example, it can be used as hay, with a similar crude protein content as timothy. And as I mentioned, thanks to its sod-forming ability, it's an excellent choice for erosion control. Plus, the rhizomes are actually edible. We've not tried them ourselves yet, but from what we've read, they can be dried and ground up into a nutritious flour, steeped to make tea, and even burned as an incense. So rather than seeing quackgrass as just another garden weed, perhaps I should instead think of it as simply misunderstood. Over time, we hope to learn more about foraging for wild edibles, and who knows, maybe quackgrass will one day become one of our favorites. But for now, I think we'll stick with our plan to remove it from the garden. I'll just try to be less annoyed by it in the process. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and we'll see you soon.